Hi everyone, sorry I wasn't able to make the rescheduled thing that we arranged, but as you know, we were notified about it after the actual session had gone away. So anyway, the point of the exercise is just to recap, which is all I was going to do anyway, and do a few Q&As with you. So by all means, if you've got any questions or anything like that that come out of it, then please obviously email me. Thanks to those of you that have sent in bits and pieces of the workbook for me to have a look at. Obviously, hopefully the feedback that I've given you will assist you in the way that you use that and do anything with it. Just so that you know, I'm not around between the 22nd and the 30th of this month. Well, basically not around until between the 22nd and New Year's Day, really. After that, if there's anything that you want to get in touch about or anything, then obviously please do. I've got no problem with that whatsoever. Excuse me, just need to get a drink. Okay, so the basis of what we're doing is to just recap the sorts of things that we looked at in the module itself. Essentially, there was a few issues that we dealt with. So it was about the policy drivers in relation to waste law. So we looked at those at international law, European law and at UK law. We looked at the policy hierarchies that inform all of that sort of thing. So essentially around that waste hierarchy idea of the reduction of waste, maybe the reuse of it, maybe the recycling, and what recycling can actually entail. Things like, whether incineration is recycling or not, whether or not putting it in the context of Devonport and the Plymouth incinerator, that's actually going to be something that's useful and contributes effectively to sustainable waste management. And then obviously the worst out of the lot of it is the concept of whether or not then we go on to dispose what can't be dealt with otherwise than through the hierarchy. So the workbook was trying to lead you through those stages of pain, if you like, but anyways, through the stages. And part of that was then how the law can get involved in making these sort of policy ideas, the idea that maybe we should reduce the amount of waste that's going to landfill, or reduce the amount of waste that's got no further beneficial use, and how the law can then be framed in a way that actually reflects that policy and drives it forward, makes it useful in some sort of effective way. It's no surprise, and if you've had a look at previous exam papers or anything like that, then it is absolutely no surprise that what I'm asking you to do is to evaluate the effectiveness of that policy and evaluate the law in delivering that policy. So that's essentially what it's all about. One of the things that we focused on particularly was around the idea of environmentally sound waste management, whatever that may be. We looked at things like the Waste Framework Directive's definition of the purposes of waste management, which would be to protect human health and also to protect the environment. That was the basic thing there set out in Article 4. And then we moved on to look at the very wide purpose that is generated within that, and the very wide ideas that are contained within that about that protection of the environment and human health, and how waste might then actually be able to go forward, or waste law might be able to go forward and ensure that those sorts of policy things are being delivered. Excuse me, again, this is quite dry work in front of the light. Nearly always, and particularly the case in relation to legal studies, then it's going to come down to ideas of definition. And so we split this up, or I split this up, excuse me, I'm just going to put this down a sec. I split this up into a couple of key areas, which was the international dimension to this, the way in which transboundary movements of hazardous waste were dealt with, and then also put that into the context of a broader waste idea, which is based on UK and EU approaches to the way that this is dealt with. So the way that law helps deliver these policies is the fact that waste is defined according to the particular pieces of law that we're dealing with. So the first part of the workbook pretty much considered the idea of the Basel Convention and what that was about, and about transboundary movements of hazardous waste. So it's all about the idea of moving waste from where it's generated more often than not to somewhere else where it's going to be disposed of. And you know, I mentioned the Reggie Yates insider idea that you could have a look at that documentary and get a sense of where that's going in terms of the UK and Ghana, how that particularly worked or didn't work, as you probably worked out from the documentary. The thing with the law that's been brought up against that is that it's evolved very quickly from a basis where there wasn't any law in the mid-80s to something where there's a relatively sophisticated system and scheme that's in operation to deal with it. But remember, Basel only deals with international waste management approaches. That's all it's about. It's about getting across the idea that transboundary movements are regulated in some way, that they only apply to hazardous wastes, and it has to transfer across international borders. That is based on the notion of prior informed consent, so countries must be able to agree that they're going to receive that waste, and we saw examples like the Ibama case with Brazil, the MSC Serena, and we saw also, excuse me, my throat's going, we saw also issues around situations where countries aren't going to be able to deal with the waste that they get in that particular way. And so one way that we can get around that is looking at things like cases when wastes are mixed, for example, which might not exactly be in line with Basel recognition and requirements. We also looked at the Organisation for the Economic Cooperation and Development rules. That is in there in terms of the fact that it places theoretically a ban on anything being shipped to less developed countries unless it's for a purpose of recycling and unless it's a green waste. So you've got that idea of red wastes, amber wastes and green waste in terms of what can be moved around. And then also, obviously, because this is a piece of international law, and if you remember right at the start, the emphasis was on the fact that you've got international law, you've got European law, you've got UK law, and they all gear together to sort of make something that's effective in a national context. Then what you have there is the European implementation of Basel, which goes a little bit further, as you found out in the workbook, and then also at the same time you've got the UK implementation of that as well. Because it's an EU regulation, it has to be forced into UK law, absolutely to the letter. And within the workbook again, there was a few case examples that we looked at where people were prosecuted for their export of waste illegally to various countries. And so again, there's a few other examples in the workbook that you might want to have a look at, follow up, and get a true sense of what's going on there. Let's put that to one side and just think of waste in a more general circumstance. And so that would be how the UK and the EU deals with just, I guess, what you call normal waste, run-of-the-mill type waste, the stuff that isn't inherently hazardous, but obviously in terms of the fact that if it's not dealt with in a sustainable or a useful sort of way, then it may pose threats to human health or the environment, which is obviously the purpose that the law is trying to overcome. We saw that that is dealt with in terms of type. So what type of waste is actually being dealt with? Is it commercial? Is it domestic? For example, then on that basis, is it something that is defined, explained in a European waste catalogue, like wood waste or something like that? How then that is looked at in terms of the Waste Framework Directive, what that sets out, what the Environmental Protection Act offences are, Section 33, Section 34, for example, that we talked about in the session last time, and then also the environmental permitting regulations, what they actually place as a requirement on people that are involved in waste management and where those offences can arise. So that then becomes important. Understanding those offences, understanding that quite often they're strict liability offences, it's just that there's no argument to it, but occasionally there will be a defence as well, and what that entails, whether it's a deposit or whether it's anything like that. The next thing, and the final thing that we moved on to there, was the concept of alternative alternatives to the criminal regime. So instead of just beating people up about the fact that they haven't done the right thing, instead of imposing custodial sentences or fines upon them for not having done something, then maybe we attack it from the other end. Maybe we look at inputs into the waste cycle, and so maybe start to impose liability on people placing materials that then could actually become waste, and the idea being that it incentivises them to behave in a different way, creating less waste. Excuse me, just need to get another drink. So, yeah, right, here we go. Perfect example, not a plastic bottle, a glass one. But anyway, so how's that targeting worked? How have we actually dealt with that sort of stuff? Most of the law, as I was alluding to just a minute ago, most of the law has centred around disposal, and is centred around the offences when people dispose of waste or discard it in a way that is going to be a danger to the human health or the environment. It's basically on those ideas. But that's kind of the wrong end of the spectrum, if anything. We've got a very broad definition of what waste is. We've got a very broad concept of what the disposal offences actually might be as well. And so, yes, it's a good plan. It's a good approach to deal with that. But by the time that the person is actually brought to justice, maybe or not, then the offence has happened, the waste has been deposited, and so we're playing catch up. We're only doing it after the event. That doesn't necessarily mean that the environment is actually being protected, but one thing that we can probably say from that is that if a person is successfully convicted, then the consequences of that conviction could then end up with things like Section 73 orders in terms of civil liability orders. It could be a Section 59 order, which would mean that they would be required to actually clear up that waste. And sorry, Section 59 and 73 is the Environmental Protection Act here I'm talking about. So that there are compensatory mechanisms that might actually be there. Also, at the same time, it might be the European Environmental Liability Directive comes into play to also mean that the person that created the problem also then has to be the person to clear it up. But, like I said, that's only one side of it. That's only the real end game that we're talking about. Otherwise, what we need to think about is targeting that input side, how that happens. And the main focus of that, and the main focus within the workbook, the main focus within the lecture and the sessions that we had about that, was about concepts around producer responsibility. So, for example, we looked at packaging waste, we looked at end-of-life vehicles, we looked at waste electrical equipment. So within that sort of thing, then more often than not, what happens is that there are recycling targets that may be set for that sort of thing. So it means that the packaging regulations and the packaging directive, which spawned those regulations, requires that there are certain targets that are set for certain materials, that cardboard must be recycled, wood must be recycled to a certain level. And if we're able to do that, then this is going to be a great thing. This is the perspective that we're all after. Equally, we looked at measures like taxation. You're aware of it in a broader context of things like carbon taxes and that sort of thing. But we looked specifically, in the workbook, looked specifically at the landfill tax and the fact that it costs more and more and more money to dump material that isn't inert into a landfill. It's said to you in the lecture at the time, then the inert rate has stayed the same over time, whereas the non-inert rate, and anything that isn't an inert waste, has escalated quite considerably since the tax was first brought in 1996. So having a look at how that probably then starts to influence behaviour, maybe it influences behaviour negatively, maybe we get a lot more fly tipping now. There's been material that's been floating around in the press over the last couple of weeks to suggest that local authorities are suffering a problem with this. So maybe this is a consequence of taxation measures, maybe it's a consequence of austerity and a general downturn full stop, who knows, but it's always something to bear in mind. But what the point of the exercise is we're looking at that input side. How do we reduce inputs into the waste cycle that then actually don't need to be regulated and don't need to be prosecuted in the sort of negative way that the criminal law actually brings up? So how do we assess that? How do we assess the fact that that's sort of going on? Well, let's think about the sustainability context of that. What is the point of it? Are we arguing that it's a more sustainable way to deal with waste management? Are we thinking that engaging things like environmental concepts like the polluter pays principle or the precautionary principle in terms of the means that we deal with that, are they helping us to make the sustainability of waste management more realistic or more likely, more achievable and that sort of thing? And so that's the sort of evaluative things that I want you to be thinking about when you're revising this, when you're actually putting this all together and trying to form some sort of an argument. Excuse me, I'm just going to get a drink. Now, I've included here a couple of aid memoirs, which it's a sort of, it's more or less a process, and so I'm going to take you through these. You've got a couple of them which should help in terms of your understanding of how you would frame a response to anything that you're going to get asked about this. Like I said, it's always going to be evaluative. That's the nature of stage 2 of a degree. That's the sort of thing that we want you to do. So how do we assess that? Well, if you start with the issues, what are the issues that we need to understand? We need to understand harm to human health, the fact that waste does potentially pose an enormous hazard, not just with hazardous wastes, but also with plastics, for example. Apparently we're all ingesting loads of them now, so that could be something that you might want to consider. On that basis as well, then there's the effective use of resources. Again, plastics is a brilliant example at the moment, because one of the things that's being trotted out by the plastics industry, who have got very defensive since things like Blue Planet have been aired, is that plastics help us reduce food waste, for example. Well, there's a trade-off there somewhere along the line, perhaps. Just something to think about there. Recently, we're dealing with concepts such as circular economy and the idea that, actually we can design wastes out of processes, or waste should actually then become a raw material for something else, and this is something that the EU, through its most recent action programme, has picked up. Again, there's reference to that within the workbook, and you can sort of think on those sorts of ideas. And then finally, in terms of issues, then there will be the impact of regulation. Has it actually done anything? We can pose that question all the time. Has regulation actually helped the situation? Short answer, yes it has, but as with anything to do with law, with anything to do with these sorts of regulatory mechanisms, there's a hell of a lot of unpicking that needs to go on to actually make sure that we can make a reasoned argument as to why that would be the case. How have those issues been responded to would be the next sort of thing to have in mind if you're framing the idea about taking this on a logical reasoning process. So it would be the degree to which the waste is regulated, how waste is, the limits that are placed on its movement, for example. If we can stop it from moving from one place to another like Basel does, then we can stop the most dreadful impacts of it. We can impose liability upon the carrier, we can impose liability upon the people that seek to move it from one place to another. This is probably useful. Then also there's the criminal aspect of this. This is how it's done. And then we've, as we're talking about, we provide the incentives to reduce, recycle, do something else with the waste that isn't actually just then going to be badly environmentally managed or just chucked in a landfill so that it's no use to anybody. There was an interesting story that you may or may not have picked up on about a guy in Newport who currently is trying to sue the local authority to allow him to dig up a landfill site because he threw away his old laptop. His old laptop has got $74 million worth of Bitcoin on it. He threw it away when Bitcoin was worth not anywhere near that sort of amount of money. Thought he was throwing away a lot. Actually, he's thrown away something valuable. Now, obviously, not everything's going to be worth $70 million that you throw away, but there is value in waste, as we know, and there is value in the recyclables that might be there. So, keep that in mind as to whether the incentives to actually do that are useful or not. Finally, what you're doing here is determining effectiveness. That's the whole point. So, is it effective? Does it mean that what we're doing depends on how you define something? Is that what's going to make it effective or not? Is it a broad definition that you take, or is it a narrow one, hazardous or non-hazardous, etc., etc.? Then there's also the enforcement. Do people want to actually follow this up or not? Do they have the power to do it, and what does that mean? And also, is it a priority? You know, what is a priority in terms of waste management? If it is, great, that's fantastic. If it isn't, well, how can we help that along the way a little bit? And perhaps at the moment, some of the sort of circumstances that are going around about plastics, for example, are going to mean that manufacturers may, or packagers may, want to think in other ways about how they deal with this sort of thing. Excuse me. One more go on this, and I think we should be all right. Okay, so that takes us on to the second part of our aid memoir, and that's about, after you've framed the basic argument in your mind and what components might actually fit into that, it's about how you provide the evidence for that. And obviously, you're scientists, you work from evidence-based, that's entirely what you do. Lawyers, slightly different, obviously, as you know, relatively random, seriously. We're social scientists, essentially, and so our evidence comes from a slightly different base. Our evidence comes from things like the action programmes, the EU action programmes. What's the policy? Where's the driver coming from? We look at the waste hierarchy. Is that actually being fulfilled? You know, is that policy, is it working? Is it effective? We look at things like making more from waste, you know, again, circular economy ideas, and then also at the same time it's that creation of obligations, that creation of responsibilities, of potentially markets in waste products or recyclables and things like that too. How the law then responds to those drivers, in much the same way as we were talking about the policy earlier, how they respond to those drivers and make them happen then is how we determine whether they're working properly or not. So does the Waste Framework Directive help us in this sort of circumstance? Does the international hazardous waste regime through Basel and everything that comes underneath it, does that actually deliver? And can things like the producer responsibility ideas through the packaging regs and that sort of thing, do they actually provide any sort of means by which you can safely say that this policy is being dealt with, or otherwise? What are the critiques that you might want to apply to it as well? And so in terms of the definitions, in terms of the enforcement, then yeah, we've got some pretty broad definitions out there, but there's also complexity within it all as well. And so you would do well to just have a look at some of the little tweaks around the edges as well. So in terms of the case law we looked at on transshipment, for example, if you were to go down a route of international waste law, then the creation of strict liability offences, what that actually means and how that can contribute, because it means that the person that's being regulated more often than not has no way out of this. They've committed the offence, they've got no comeback on that, they've done what it is that they need to do. So waste is important. In the overall scheme of things, waste is important in the EU and UK policy landscape. It's still there as a big thing. I don't want to bang on about the impacts of Brexit on this at the moment, because we really don't know enough about it or what the implications are, because it changes on a daily basis. When we meet up again next year in the third year, we can probably have a little chat about it with some sort of sense. But look towards things like the European Commission's homepages. You've got all of this material within the workbook. Look to DEFRA. And look to the Basel Convention homepages and things like that, and you will get a lot of further information that you won't get from me or in the textbooks. I just want to sort of kind of finish up really with a couple of FAQs, because obviously, I'm not in the room with you, and so normally you would be asking me these things. Normally you'll be asking me these things, and so I've just put a couple of FAQs up here, and I'll just sort of explain them. Beyond that, like I said, I'm around other than those particular days from the 22nd until the 2nd of January. So please do email me if you think of anything else that I'm not dealing with. How do you reference? How do I reference? You reference exactly the same as you would do if it was an assignment. This is a takeaway paper, you've got access to your references, and so because of that we would expect you to be able to actually provide your references. Note that references and bibliography don't count towards your word limit on this, so feel free to add plenty. Also, can you include diagrams or can you include graphs in your response? Yes is the short answer to that. And again, they don't count to the word limit. One thing I would say though, it's supposed to be an essay, it's not a picture book, so really don't overdo them. Just don't. That's all, lovely as they are, and as artistic as you all are, I'm sure. Should I include references to cases and sections of acts and regulations and that sort of thing? Yes, absolutely. That's your evidence. That's the sort of thing that shows that you're not just making a general, broad, sweeping statement about the law. You can actually relate it to the bit that says that's where the obligation gets created. That's where the impetus of it goes. It's the evidence that you'd use for your evaluation. Finally, how long should it be? Well, be guided by the word count instructions that come to play in relation to the particular exam rubric. Now, just as a final note on this, there will be a revision session after the new year with all of the module team. Charlie, Linda and myself will all get together and come and have a chat with you about, things to do. We've got a timetable session at some point in the week beginning the 8th, I think. But anyway, all it remains for me to do is to wish you a very happy Christmas and a happy New Year, and thanks very much indeed for your patience in relation to me this year. Thanks, bye.